Thank you very much for joining into this webinar. We are doing this webinar on the latest medical device software guidelines, which have been issued by CDSCO. This webinar is being done by me. My name is Anay Shukla. I'm the founding partner of Arogya Legal and Arogya Compliance. I am joined by my very, very competent colleague, Bhumika Sehgal, who is a senior associate with our firm and takes care of the medical device industry side of practice of the firm, right? Bhumika, next slide, please. Okay, we are going to be just Bhumika, one slide before, please. One slide before. Yeah, so we're going to be using some names, some logos, and some images as part of this presentation. We just want to be very, very clear that all of that is for educational purposes only. If we take names, if we give examples, all of that is for educational purposes only, right? Next. Bhumika, I think it's, of course, we are a firm of specialists. Yeah, and that's both of us, right? Let's move on. Right, so what are we going to do, right? Why did we have this session? So why don't I first answer, why did we have this session, right? Now, software is everywhere, right? And software which has medical uses is now regulated, right? We've, for a very long time, lived in an ecosystem, or I would say we've lived within a regulatory framework where medical devices themselves were not regulated. There was a time when medical devices were regulated as drugs. Then came a time when medical devices got its own standalone regulatory framework not too long ago, right? There was confusion on how medical devices, are supposed to be regulated for the longest time, even after we got the medical device rules some time ago, right? But even after that, there was lack of clarity on how some kind of medical devices are regulated. So if you ask me today, how are, say, for example, veterinary medical devices that focus on animals, how are they regulated? The answers are not very obvious, right? One such key category of medical device, which frankly affects almost all MedTech manufacturers out there, is software as a medical device, right? There was lack of clarity on how software as a medical device is supposed to be licensed. For example, how do you make the application? How do you prepare the device master file? What are the standards against which you test a software which has medical purpose, right? So last year in 2025, there was one guideline which was published for comments for the public, right? And that guidelines frankly gave some insights into how the regulator is viewing the regulation of software within a framework which is not necessarily meant for medical devices, right? So just to give you an example, currently our labeling requirements would require, say, declaration of shelf life, right? Or, material of construction or something to that effect, right? How does that work in case of software? Like, nobody knows, right? How would you actually approach making an application, filling a form that has these fields, right? Not very clear. What are the standards which are applicable to certain kind of medical device softwares? Not very clear, right? So the CDSCO, which is our central medical device regulator, attempted to answer some of these questions last year through a regulatory guideline, so to say. And just last week, it published the final guideline on the subject, which has now brought clarity to several, topics which, earlier were not very clear, right? Now, as we speak, what are those topics which have now been given clarity? And what are those topics to which the clarity is still anticipated? We will discuss or try to discuss as part of this webinar, right? But how are we planning to do that is right in front of you. How do we plan to pace this webinar? we are going to do the following, right? We are going to first talk about pain points that our clients have told us, right? About what the issue they're facing or how they're approaching us, saying that this is basically our challenge with medical device softwares, right? We will talk about what has really changed in our view from the last year's guideline, from the last year's draft guidelines, right? We will differentiate between different kind of software. So there are, as you know, we all use, say, for example, trackers and wearables and so on and so forth. What is a medical device? What is not a medical device? Let's have some conversation around it, right? When we say general wellness purposes, what does it actually mean? How do you attribute risk to such kind of softwares, right? That also is a discussion that we can have. Most softwares are built in IT offices, right? They're not built in factories, right? So in such cases, who's actually the manufacturer of these softwares? Those kind of conversations will happen. What's the regulatory pathway to get license for these devices? How do we label a medical device? How do you invoice a medical device? We'll have a conversation around it. We'll touch upon cybersecurity and data protection a little. We'll talk about penalties. So that's really how we have sort of designed this webinar for all of you. We'll try to cover as much base as possible. But as I said, while I was sort of starting this webinar, we cannot get into too many details and we cannot keep this very, very basic. That's really, because of the kind of people, like the group that has joined this session. Okay, fantastic. Now, Bhumika, can we go to the next slide, please? Right. So what are the issues, right? What is really the pain point that the industry has faced for the longest time? The biggest pain point in our minds is to decide what is a medical device software and what is not a medical device software, right? This differentiation is not very obvious. It is very obvious when you think that a medical device software is going to actually diagnose a condition, right? So for example, if there is an AI app which is able to detect breast cancer, very simple. This is a medical device diagnostic software, whatever. But what about an app which is used for continuous glucose monitoring by athletes who want to have a certain level of metabolism, who want to achieve a certain level of performance, and therefore they need to track glucose in their bodies, right? So continuous glucose monitoring devices are medical devices. Software used in these medical devices for obvious reasons may be medical software. But what if these devices are actually not used by people who have diabetes, but by athletes who want to optimize their performance? Now, what happens? In this case, what happens, right? What if there is a health tracker which I use on a daily basis, which is able to track my heartbeats, my SpO2, and so on and so forth, but is also able to give some analysis. Now, this analysis is not necessarily going to diagnose, but this analysis is going to lead me to, say, for example, go see a doctor. This kind of leading suggestion, this analysis done to give a leading suggestion to go see a doctor. Is it a medical device or not a medical device, right? So that clarity has always challenged everyone, right? The industry, regulators, and so on and so forth. Some of that is now clear, right? And how is that clear? That comes from the intended use statement. Now, what is the intended use statement? That also is not clear. All of us know that our devices ship with something called the instruction for use, IFU. But the IFU in bits and parts has intended use, it has intended purpose, it has a lot of data, right? But what is intended use? What decides what becomes a medical device? I may write something in the IFU. I may write something in my press release. I may write something on my website. What decides what's the intended use of my product? And why is the intended use relevant? We'll talk about it. Health tracking features, I've given that example. When does a health tracking feature become a medical device? How are OTA, over the air updates, actually regulated, right? I have a, say, for example, I have a ventilator, or I have a blood analyzer. I have one of these big equipment. These equipment already have software embedded inside them. But there may be features that may actually get pushed into these equipment. The features that get pushed into these equipment are driven by the equipment, but may not necessarily be required in order, like it may not necessarily rely on that equipment in order to give an outcome that is sort of required, right? So how does this OTA work, right? How do this software that gets pushed over the internet, how is it regulated? Is a separate license required, not required? How is risk classified? How do you really classify risk of a medical device, right? Like, medical device risk classification is super critical, super critical. It decides what licenses are required in order to sell. It decides what kind of, money is required in order to, make the application, what kind of data is required to be submitted to the regulator, and so on and so forth, right? So risk classification is critical. How do you risk classify? Who's the actual manufacturer of a medical device? Is it the IT department sitting within the corporate office? That's another question. How do you decide the shelf life of a medical device, right? I keep coming back to this question because that question is not very obvious to me, or was not obvious to me, right? How do you test raw materials? So typically when you manufacture any, I would say medical equipment, which is actually physical medical equipment, you would need to make sure that whatever components are being used to make the final product go through some amount of checks, right? If this was a pharmaceutical product, there would be raw material testing involved. This is a medical equipment, there would be some sort of checks, right? In a software, what are those checks? How do you actually validate, some of these things, right? What if the software that you're using to make your medical device is not a medical device? It's commonly available open source software. How do you test that? What do you test it against? How do you label a medical device? Let's say, for example, if in case of over-the-air updates, right? The medical device is just going to get downloaded literally from the cloud into the device. What kind of labeling would exist? How do you label? How do you invoice? What do you write on the invoice? Would you write the name generically, right? Would you write so and so health tracker? Or then if this health tracker has two versions, which has two different versions of softwares, one with advanced, say, medical device tracking, one without advanced medical tracking, would you write the version numbers in those invoicing? What is cybersecurity in context of medical devices? So these are not all the questions, but these are some of the critical questions that keep coming up over and over again when we talk about software as a medical device and its regulation in India. Now, some of these questions have been answered, right? And this is basically what this webinar is about, right? What we need to understand, right, is our regulatory landscape is changing very, very quickly. 6 years ago, medical devices on the whole were not regulated, literally only 6 years ago. And in 6 years, not only are all medical devices regulated, we are now talking about some sort of assessment of non-medical features in a health tracker, which also has medical features. So the device is not a medical device. It has non-medical features, obviously, maybe one medical feature. We have now gone to the extent where the regulator is expecting that the non-medical features also be, in some sense, evaluated for its impact on the medical features of the health tracker, which in itself is not a medical device. So a lot of these changes are happening, and frankly, some of these changes are difficult to keep track of, right? But that is what this guideline is about. It's trying to answer some of these questions. Okay, Bhumika, why don't we go next to the next slide? Right. So first thing, what has changed? Some of you have read the draft guidelines of last year, right? So some of you already may know answers to the questions I just raised. And that's great, right? Now, you may not have read, or you may also be wondering what really has changed from the draft guidelines of last year, right? I had the same question. And when I started reading, my immediate impression was these guidelines have bits and components from last year's guidelines, but they seem to be completely new in the way they've approached it, in the way what's written in it, in the examples that they've given, in the kind of clarity that they have while writing about the regulatory pathway for software as in medical devices, right? So just to give you an example, before the 2026 guidelines, the whole industry, right, used to talk about software as a medical device in two terms, right? SIMD, SAMD, software in a medical device, software as a medical device. Both of these concepts do not find mention in the 2026 guidelines. And I think that's relevant because we have to stop using these terms, right? There is nothing called SIMD anymore. There is now MDSW, which is the equivalent of SIMD or embedded software. And then there is standalone MDSW, right? And we will talk about what both of these are. But maybe we should spend 1 minute understanding why this differentiation was a bit of a problem, right? And over-the-air updates is a good example, right? So what you see in front of you seems to be the image of a ventilator. Okay, this ventilator obviously has an embedded software which interacts with the hardware components of the device and gives an output which is visible to the healthcare practitioner using the equipment, right? So there is the hardware part of it, and it has a lot of accessories and components that you can see, right? For example, the cannulas and the masks and so on and so forth. It also has a software component which is inside. These are interacting with each other. And it is giving an output, right? It is saying, what is the breathing rate, what should be the balance of oxygen and so on and so forth in the inhalation and exhalation. Now, if there is an over-the-air update, which adds a feature to this particular equipment, which is not connected to the core features of the equipment, but the update runs within the equipment. So the software feature runs within the equipment, right? It changes the intended use in a great degree of the equipment. So while it was able to do A, B, and C, the over-the-air update is bringing a new feature to the equipment, a D feature to the equipment. This over-the-air update is residing in the equipment, right? It runs through the equipment. It has an effect through the equipment. Will it be software in a medical device? But it has been pushed on a standalone basis over the air, right? It has independent existence to the extent of what intended use it has. Without it, the ventilator continues to do its job. With it, there are additional uses that can be put to the equipment. Now, this kind of update, which is pushed over the air, has hardware dependencies, but is able to perform independent function. Is that SIMD? Is that SAMD? That sort of confusion keeps happening, right? So that has been made redundant, right? And we'll get into the discussions about how licensing works in these OT updates in some time. But that is really why, maybe one reason why this SIMD, SAMD concept has been done away with. As of now, to answer that question, if the software is part of a medical device, that is a medical device software. If it is not part of a medical device, but works either on standalone basis or in combination with a medical device, then this software is called standalone software. So there is medical device software and standalone medical device software. That's the only two differentiation. So if the update that example that I gave to you just now works in combination, right, is not part of the equipment, but in somehow works in combination with the device, that would become a standalone medical device software, right? It could be categorized as a standalone medical device software. So that's really the distinction. The other key thing that I felt has changed from the draft guidelines is how much the exceptions to general wellness software have been explained. Now, any general wellness software is not a medical device. And we will get into the discussions of what is the explanation in course of the webinar. But the guidelines get into details that no, even if you're a general wellness software, but if you say these things, you will become a medical device. So the clarity that has come is going to tremendously help the wearable industry, some of these other health trackers, and so on and so forth. Right? So that wasn't there, but that has come. There is now a clarity on how do you approach licensing of software, which is part of a medical device. So if it comes embedded into a medical device, the guidelines will now say, oh, you can, you please write it down as an accessory or component, which can keep getting upgraded, right? So you can then basically file your endorsement app. The guidelines may keep getting updated, right? The software may keep getting updated, but the way to register embedded software is by adding them as accessory or component into your main application. So whenever there is a change, you may then file an appropriate application to register that change in the software version, right? But there may be other updates also. There may be, for the same example, OTA update that gets added to the ventilator. The clarification, for example, it says is that now when such kind of situation exists, that the over-the-air update is invoiced separately, is going to be used in the same equipment, but not going to be shipped with the same equipment. You need to take a separate license for these kind of software. So that sort of clarity has come. Then, say, for example, off-the-shelf software, which is not, say, for example, Windows or Linux or some of these, libraries that are used by software libraries which are used by medical device companies, which are not medical device softwares. If the equipment/software leverages it, then what does it need to do in order to get that license? That has been clarified. So lots of such things are now clarified in the draft guidelines. There are a lot of examples given on what is a medical device and what is not a medical device, right? So we will talk about some of these things as we discuss, as we go sort of into the webinar, right? So next slide, please. Okay. So, what is a medical device software, right? The answer to this question is very simple. Software which is intended for a medical purpose in context of humans and animals will make any software a medical device software, right? What do we need to know? Intended purpose or intended use, which has a medical purpose, right? Now, what is intended use? We will see. What is medical purpose? We will see. But as of now, let's go take a step back. We said there are two types of softwares: MDSW, which is the equivalent of embedded software, or standalone MDSW, which is basically over the air, or let me put it the other way, which can be used alone or in combination of a medical device. So that software has a standalone medical function that will become a standalone software. It can operate independently. So some of the softwares that basically work through the cloud, or some of the softwares that work in combination. So some of the data may actually come from another source, but it is able to process that data. That will become a standalone medical device. Right? So that's really the differentiation that we need to keep in mind while we are talking about medical device software. Two types: embedded, which is MDSW, or standalone, which is basically able to operate by itself. Right? Can we move on, please? Okay. Now, as I said, intended use statement. Now, what are the components of intended use statement? We will see, right? But this is the expression which this is what has been sort of defined in the guidelines, right? And it is all for us to see, which is that, it is what is it intended to be able to do that becomes the intended use of a medical device. The intended use is super critical because it determines whether the product is a medical device. It determines the risk classification of a medical device. If a regulator tomorrow sees a product and sort of tries to look for intended use, the regulator will look at a bunch of things to decide whether the product is actually a medical device or not. Very interestingly, the promotional material which is used in relating to the device forms part of the intended use statement, right? What does that mean? It means that I may have, I may basically at the time of making the application, filing, whatever, give a certain intended use to the regulator, but on the website start claiming something else, right? What appears on the website, what appears on the promotional material that goes before HCPs is also used to determine intended use by the regulator later. We have a client who was investigated by a joint team of CDSCO and the relevant state licensing authority. And their devices, which were health trackers, frankly, were seized. This particular client had actually made an application to obtain medical device licenses. Like, for example, for a particular feature that they were testing, they wanted to obtain a medical device manufacturing license. The mistake was that they had put out interviews and they had heavily hinted towards medical use of this particular device in the media. So the regulator said, you know what, we agree, you've done all the diligence, but here, look at what this website says, look at what your website says, and so on and so forth. And they came and they seized all the devices and took them away. What is important is that this particular client actually knew that what they're testing is a medical device feature and they need a license in order to roll it out. But where they fell short was to appreciate that promotional materials, any data on the internet, is also used for determining what you're actually trying to market the device for, right? Now, taking a step back, intended use for medical purposes will make a device a medical device. Now, what is medical purpose? Obviously, diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, mitigation, treatment, etc. That's medical device definition, and that's really what medical purpose is. But sometimes you may use words such as mitigation. You may use words such as management. You may use words such as alleviation, right? Now, these words would typically not fall under the scope of, say, diagnosis, prevention, treatment, etc., etc. Okay. There are case laws to this effect, which say that, no, this is not the same as treatment. Management is not the same as treatment. Some of these other words are not the same as treatment. But what has the regulator done? The regulator has now clarified that some of these loose expressions, which actually mean the same, but read differently, would make any product a medical device. So we have to be careful. Those of you who somehow deal with products which are not necessarily medical devices, but would like to, be in that area where it can have medical purposes, make sure that your intended use / promotional material statements are not hinting towards medical uses by using expressions which are not like treatment, whatever, which are very direct, but things like, alleviation, mitigation, so on and so forth, right? Okay. Now, next slide, please. Okay. Now, what is the relevance of intended use statement? As I said before, it is used for risk classification, deciding whether separate licenses required, because if the intended use is different, then the regulator may not allow you to file an endorsement application, may say that, no, this is, may not allow you to file a line extension application, may say that, this seems to be a different product, different intended use, come under a different route, right? So all of these things become relevant. And so intended use needs to be taken care of and treated very, very seriously. Right? That single statement, and one of our recommendations for those who have joined this webinar is to go back and make sure that the intended use statement appears very boldly on the website in other terms and conditions, and make this limited. Let's say that this is the intended use and nothing else. That way, the regulator will then have to look at other places and then say, no, but why did you write that? Why did you write this? If you don't say this is specifically the intended use of what is a non-medical product also, then the regulator may start looking at things and, start asking questions. So this intended use as a word needs to appear over and over again in all documentation. And if it appears, it needs to be sort of further fine-tuned. And how to further fine-tune? Let's find that out. Bhumika, next, please. Yeah, so as I said, how do we draft it? These are some of the things that need to appear in any intended use statement. This is all coming from the guidelines. So what is the purpose? Who's the target? What is the target disease or condition? What is the intended population? Who's the intended user? What are the contraindications? Where will it basically work? All of this should technically form part of the intended use statement as per the regulator. Next slide, please. This is for IVDs. Obviously, IVDs and medical devices are different verticals within the same industry. They somehow are regulated together as medical devices. But even for IVDs, and I know some of you are from the IVD industry, intended use is super critical, right? So make sure that your intended use is very, very clear about what is it seeking to do. Now, if say, for example, your product is already approved and now it is being given again for say renewal the next year, will the regulator necessarily ask you a question about intended use? May not, right? But can they ask? Yes. Will India's intended use suddenly change vis-a-vis the whole world's intended use for products that are sold around the world? We don't think so. Can it change? Yes. Why? Because the guidelines now say it in black and white, right? Has intended use become a problem at the time of making applications while getting sort of products approved from the regulator? So many times, right? Some of you from the regulatory team know that intended use becomes critical and things actually go and stop on intended use, especially say, for example, when you're doing a predicate search, right? You're giving a predicate for a product and the intended use is slightly different and so on and so on, right? So intended use is super critical and there is no guidance on intended use coming from this particular document, which you're seeing in front of you. Next slide, Bhumika, please. Okay, now on this slide, we've just given a lot of examples of what are the kind of medical devices which have been listed as examples, going back to how I said earlier that we'll discuss examples of medical devices. Bhumika, why don't you sort of quickly, show us some of the examples? And I'm not going to read it out. It's on the screen. Some of you who can see the screen, feel free to take a quick look. Right, Bhumika, can we say, yeah. So for example, diabetes management software, calculating insulin doses. That's one. CT scanner software, which is used to run CT scanning machines, is one. Mobile apps, for example, cloud platforms, which are basically using they're processing images to detect lesions, for example. Then, clinical decision support software, that could be a medical device. Next, ICU dashboard combining ventilator monitors and infusion pumps. That could be a medical device software. Any AI diagnostic software running on a Windows PC, right? So, you're actually selling a regular PC with a regular monitor with just one software. That AI software on the PC would be a medical device. The PC, however, you may have to give details of how the PC actually affects the operation of the medical device while getting approval for a software, which is that AI diagnostic software, which is running on the Windows platform. So that is the key part of this guideline. Yeah. Some of this, commercial off-the-shelf software, like for example, and we'll take some examples later also, but Microsoft SQL Server, if it's being used, and embedded software, for example, a ventilator control software is basically medical device. Okay. Now, can we move on, please? Right. Now, I think as much as it is important to understand what are medical devices, the regulator, and we should appreciate the regulator for this, has taken efforts to identify softwares which are not medical devices, right? And that's never easy. It's always easy to say, oh, regulate this, regulate that. This is also medical device. That's also medical device. It's difficult to say, oh, no, what, this is not a medical device, right? This is coming, there was a time when initially the regulator was publishing draft lists of medical device with their risk assessment. And you would say, for example, find toothbrushes, right? which would be categorized as medical device, and now they are not medical devices, right? So a lot of this has evolved over a period of time, and the regulator seems to have taken a forward-looking step of actually identifying software that are not medical devices. On the screen, you can see that medical teaching training software is not a medical device. Software that alters how data is represented on the screen is not a medical device. ERP systems, QMS systems are not medical devices. In fact, systems, say, for example, if there is a IVD, right, and some sort of blood analyte analyzer, whatever, right, that, how many times is it able to process a sample without failing, and how many times it fails, how many times a retest is required. So if there's a quality assessment software attached to an IVD software, that quality sort of software, which is keeping a track of how the software is performing, is not a medical device software, right? Then software that relies on medical device but has no medical purpose, right? So, there may be parts to, like, for example, a battery indicator or whatever on a medical device software or something like that, which is part of a software, which is part of a medical device. It's part of the software, but is not serving any medical purpose. That's not a medical device. Next screen, please. Right. Some other examples, but in this, specifically general wellness software, which I was talking about earlier, is something that I would like to spend some time on, right? So let's say there is a software, there is some protocol that a software uses to transfer data, not a medical device software. How it is able to reduce file size of, say, radiological images, not a medical device software. Those kind of things are not medical device software. Let's spend some time, understanding what this general wellness software is and when it becomes a medical device. That I think is super critical. Bhumika, next screen, please. Yeah, so not all software which is used within healthcare setting qualifies as a medical device software. It is understood and accepted that a software which drives people to have healthy lifestyle choices, right, is a general wellness software. It's not a medical device software. So if a software tells you that you should sleep early, not sort of eat after a particular point in time, and so on and so forth, these are all healthy choices that you make because the software is tracking when you sleep, how much you eat, and so on and so forth. That all of that is general wellness software. That's not a medical device software. But look at what the guideline says, right? It says, intended use statement of such general wellness software. See the note, the first note. Very important. Now, typically, if your product is not regulated, like your general wellness software, you will not write the intended use statement. But as I said in our recommendation, you must write. Everybody should write. There should be an intended use statement. But any promotional material, anything that makes any reference to disease, disorders, or pathological conditions can make the product an medical device. Now, this is very scary. Why? Because you would say that, please eat on time, please eat healthy, please sleep on time, maintain a certain, heartbeat, do some kind of exercising in order to avoid the risk of heart attack. Now, heart attack could be a condition, right? A disease, right? A sort of an occurrence that happens. Now, I have made a reference to this in, let's say, a promotional material for my product, because my product is actually about making people do healthy things, right? This is a little scary because it says do not make any reference to disease, disorders, or pathological conditions. So a lot of these things will become important, and maybe you can sort of go back and also make some informed choices about some of these things if you are actually dealing with a product category, which is a general wellness category, right? The second note is also important, right? Which is that if the software is intending to measure physiologic values, right, but it is going to be used for medical or clinical purposes, then it is not going to be considered a general wellness software. What does that mean? If, say, for example, BMI is being calculated, right? Now, if I calculate BMI, that may be just for my, say, health, right? But if the BMI calculator is designed specifically for people with diabetes who are taking GLP-1, drugs, right? So if it is going to be used for clinical management of people who are suffering from a chronic condition and are using some kind of drug, then that software, it is just calculating BMI, right? Body mass index. That software will become medical device software. So it's like weighing machine. You put a weighing machine in your home, not a medical device. The same weighing machine in a hospital will become a medical device. That sort of a distinction is being made, and that distinction becomes critical, and that becomes critical on how you market your product. Move on, please. Next slide, please. Right. We discussed about health trackers and medical devices. What's the regulatory boundary? On the left side, you see the general wellness functions. On the right side, you see medical purposes. Sleep monitoring is not a problem. Diet tracking is not a problem. But ECG or some of these advanced if some of these advanced diseases or conditions are being somehow, like for example, data is being monitored to somehow give an indication that there may be something wrong, that could be medical purpose, right? And the interesting part here is that the product may continue to be a health tracker. It may have non-medical / general wellness features, but there would be one feature which is going to be medical feature. That medical feature may be the medical device. The entire health tracker may not become medical device, right? So the software will become medical device, which uses data from non-medical sources in order to give a clinical outcome, right? Okay, Bhumika, next screen, please. Next slide. Right. So Bhumika, okay. At this point, I'm going to take a break. Bhumika, who's my colleague, is going to take over and now start talking about how risk is calculated and so on and so forth. Bhumika, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. So we would now discuss the risk-based classification for medical device softwares. So the risk-based classification that is done for softwares is majorly done on two parameters. One is on the basis of the setting in which it is being used. For example, it is being used in a critical, serious, or a non-serious setting, or else the data that will be generated from the software that will be used in which part of the treatment. For example, will it be used in treatment or diagnosis, or will it be used in to drive clinical management? That is, will it aid in treatment or aid in diagnosis, or will it be used in informed clinical management? So these are the basic criteria which are used to assess the risk classification for a medical device software.
Correct. And
there
Bhumika,
are
just
four.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Bhumika. Why don't you go ahead? There's one thing that I would like to add once you're done. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So there are four risk classes that has been discussed by CDSCO, which is low, which is class A. So all class A medical devices, whether it be a software or not a software, they are low risk medical devices. Then there is class B, which is low to moderate risk. Then class C, moderate to high risk, and class D, very high risk medical devices. In this, there are two parts. First, the data that is being used. So if a medical device software is being used for treatment or is generating data that will be used in treatment or diagnosis, then in that case, the and is also being used in a critical setting, which means that
All right. So there seems to be some background issue with Bhumika's setting. Bhumika, whenever you're done, just come back. But to just basically summarize what we are looking at, please connect it back to the intended use discussion that I was having. Now, if you don't know what is going to be, so for example, what is the intended use? Is it going to treat or diagnose? Is it going to give an outcome that is going to help doctors take a clinical decision about your product, right? Or is it going to sort of help doctors continue to, basically carry on giving the same treatment for you. That I think is important. So what does that mean? For example, if there is a software that is able to, say, for example, diagnose advanced cancer, critical diagnosis software, cancer detected, needs to take an action of class C, class D, whatever. Now that this person has cancer, we need to find out whether this person's genetic pool is going to be helpful to take, or sort of this person's genetic pool will take a certain kind of medication. Let's sort of find that out. That would drive clinical management because it's sort of testing the genetic pool of that person in order to evaluate whether a certain decision about his treatment can be taken or not. That's driving clinical management. Let's say that after that you've given that medication to that person, right? Now you're only tracking the health and other body parameters of that person so that you can ensure that let's say the drug is working or not, the device is working or not. That's just informing clinical management. If a body parameter falls, you will change the dosage. You will change, say, for example, how your pacemaker is working, right? So that's informing clinical management. A lot of this is relevant because it has to be in the intended use. If the regulator has to take a decision about which class your product belongs to, all of this needs to appear somehow in the intended use. In fact, who's going to use your device? Is it going to be a doctor using the device, an individual using the device? All of that needs to be mentioned. Yeah. Bhumika, are you ready?
Yes, I'm so
Okay.
sorry, there was some issue. Yeah.
Don't worry about it. Carry on.
So thank you so much, Anay, for discussing the risk-based classification for medical devices. Going ahead, then one of the major questions that we have heard from the industry is that who will be the manufacturer, actual and legal, for medical device softwares? So there can be two scenarios which can ideally exist in this case. One of which is software is being developed and is being marketed by the company themselves, and this software is being developed in their corporate offices. So then in that case, who will be the actual and legal manufacturers? Even though the distinction of actual and legal does not exist in medical devices rules for medical devices, still at the time of filing the Form 14 for import and the relevant forms for manufacturing, there exists this requirement of mentioning the actual manufacturing plant and the legal manufacturer who will be marketing the product in the markets. So in that case, when a software is being developed in the corporate office of a company, then that company, the corporate office, will be registered as the plant of the software, and the legal manufacturer will ideally be the company who is actually getting it prepared for themselves. Then in the second scenario, the cases of outsourcing. This software development process is being outsourced to a third-party vendor and is not being done by the company themselves. In that case, the IT vendor will ideally become the actual manufacturer, and the company who will be marketing the software going forward will become the legal manufacturer of the software. Now, since the manufacturer who will be the actual and legal manufacturer is quite clear, we will proceed ahead to the regulatory pathway for marketing and commercializing of medical devices and IVD software. So the process is divided into three parts: pre-launch or pre-market stage, in which the product development or the software development takes place. This can be done in the corporate office, as is discussed in the last slide, or may be done in the R&D facility of the company, where actually the software is being created, its prototype is being created and developed. The second stage is that of launching it into the, of pre-launch is test license. Now, this test license is required to be filed by the companies before the pre-launch to get their software actually tested. There are certain parameters, there are certain standards that are given by either BIS, the ISO IEC standards, or else the manufacturer's own standards as per the medical device rules, on which the software must be tested. So to test those software, certain batches, which are smaller in number, are manufactured for this purpose, and then it is extensively tested for its quality assurance and everything. So this is the second step of pre-launch or pre-market stage. Third is clinical investigation, in which a larger testing takes place, and then the product is finally launched into the Indian market with the help of a manufacturing license, loan license, or an import license. The relevant forms are given below. And after the product is launched into the market, there are certain post compliances. So there are record maintenance obligations. There are, after the market launch, the post marketing surveillance obligations. There is vigilance reporting obligation. Every time a complaint is raised, that has to be documented. CAPA and other procedures are required to be followed. So all of that forms part of the post launch compliance. Now, since we have already discussed the licenses that are required, the licensing authority for test license, import license, permissions for investigational medical devices, for manufacturing and import. This is central licensing authority. For manufacturing specifically, A and B, it's state. For C and D, it's central. So majorly, it's basically divided on the basis of risk class of a medical device software, as to which authority will actually look into the application. Then the next requirement is that of test license. One of the major questions that we have heard from the industry is, what is a test license and what is it required for? So it is, as I have already explained in short, that test license is actually a permission to manufacture small batches of the medical device before it is actually commercialized and put it into the market, into the Indian market, for testing, clinical investigation, evaluation, demonstration, or training purposes. The batches which are manufactured for medical device software under a test license is never commercialized. It cannot be sold in a commercial market. Going forward is the shelf life requirement. So one of the tests that is conducted after a test license is taken by a manufacturer is to determine the shelf life of the product. So shelf life validation is not required for medical devices software. It is prescribed by the guidelines that has been recently issued by CDSCO that shelf life validation will not be required majorly for determining the shelf life of the software. The next part is that of QMS for medical devices. So all the manufacturers and importers have to ensure that the software that they are going to put into the Indian market must have a valid QMS. The QMS system that is in place must always ensure that the software that is being developed is consistent across its life cycle. That is from the stage of design and development of the prototype to the actual testing, and then eventually when it is released into the Indian market, it should be consistent across its life cycle. Then all the risks that are identified at the time of testing it or at the time of product launch, all of that risks are identified, controlled, and are actually documented in the QMS system. So this is one of the major responsibility of the QMS of the company that is in place. Then all the changes that are being made to the version of the software, all the changes that are being made to the version of the software should always be traceable. Version control mechanisms must always be in place for a medical device software. Then cybersecurity and QMS. So one of the major requirements under the that has been newly introduced by the CDSCO guidelines is that of cybersecurity maintenance and vulnerability assessment. So the software that is developed which will be transferring certain health data, should ideally be a secured space. So cybersecurity requirements for the software is maintained in the QMS system. Then we have also listed few core standards that are applicable to the softwares. Also, at the time of submitting a manufacturing license or an import license, certain QMS documents are required to be submitted. So for manufacturing license, the manufacturer has to undertake that the site that they are QMS compliant, and an undertaking to that effect that they are compliant to the 5th schedule of medical devices rules is required to be submitted by them. And for importers, they have to submit a notarized QMS certificate from the overseas national regulatory authority from where they are actually importing the product into the Indian market. So that is generally the requirement. Then next topic is that of raw material testing. As is for the traditional medical devices, the raw materials which are used to manufacture the device are tested for their quality. However, no such traditional raw material testing exists for medical device softwares. But the software is assessed for its quality and assurance throughout its life cycle. That is, from the designing of its prototype, the software verification, designs, and validation is created from that step to the actual clinical performance evaluation in a lab which is conducted. All of those steps are individually tested for the software that will eventually be introduced into the Indian markets. So verification and design validation testing is done. Then its integration into a unit and its system testing is done. Then cybersecurity testing and its vulnerability assessment is done for the software. If there are certain gaps that has to be looked into before its launch into the markets. Then there is risk management. All the risks that are identified throughout the process of testing is documented and is looked into before its launch. Then there is version control mechanisms which are in place in case there was some loopholes in the software previous to its launch. Then all of that is looked into, and eventually a better version is introduced. So all the version control mechanisms is looked into at this stage of testing of softwares. Then clinical evaluation. So that is the end step in which the testing for the software is generally done. Then after the QMS requirements are in place and we have already applied, so all the post-launch obligations are completed and we have already received a manufacturing or an import license for the medical device software, the next step is post-marketing surveillance. Also, PMS is required at the time of filing for medical devices for which predicate exists, but for others, it is also a post-compliance. It is also a post-compliance in which the complaint handling and adverse event reporting is submitted or is actually documented and kept by the company with themselves. So all the complaints are handled, all the corrective and preventive actions that they have taken to actually against the complaints that were raised by the end users are taken into account, and then all the records are required to be maintained by them. Next is cyber security monitoring. So under the PMS requirement, even the cyber security. So in case a software is into the Indian market after they have received a license, it has been launched in the Indian market, and then there is some data breach and the cyber security mechanism has failed. So even that records are required to be maintained in the PMS data that is being compiled by the company. Then all the real world evidence collection from the Indian setting is also done under the PMS core activities by a manufacturer or an importer. Then there are certain reporting obligations. It is generally done within 15 days of a serious adverse event. to the central or the state licensing authority. The next part is that of labeling. So a medical device software has to carry certain mandatory labeling declarations, which includes the name of the software, the hardware's name, then the version control or the version number that is in place, the name and address of the manufacturer, the license number, the registration details that exist for that software, then the manufacturing date, intended use, indications for use, and storage and handling conditions. So these are the major labeling requirements that a software must carry, or a medical device software must carry on its label. Now, what will be the manner of labeling? Since it is a software, it can be supplied in two forms. First, in a physical form, in a CD, DVD, or on a pen drive. In that case, all the mandatory labeling declarations must be made on each packing level on the label of the medical device in inedible ink. Then the other form in which software is generally supplied is without a physical form. Electronic label. So in case where the label will be supplied as an electronic label, the software or the inclusion of all the mandatory labeling declarations must be made on the web address where it is available. Then on the primary landing page of the software splash screens, on that as well, the labeling declarations can be made when the software is being supplied without a physical form. Then if the software will be downloaded from app stores. So in that case, the screenshot of all the relevant information, as was discussed in the previous slide, must be included on the app store. And for the softwares where no user interface exists. So for those softwares, the application programming interface must have the mandatory labeling declarations. The next part is cybersecurity. So what exactly is cybersecurity? So protection from all unauthorized activities, which is access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction. So all the data that will be actually taken by the software as a medical device software should not be accessible to everyone. It should not be used in another way than which it is to be used. Then disclosure, its disclosure should not be public. Then disruptions, there should not be certain disruptions within the functioning of that software. Modifications should not be done by a third party agent, or destruction of whatever data has been taken by the software should not be done. So to protect the system, the cybersecurity is in place. This is majorly because of the it is like a risk to the confidentiality and integrity of the patient of whose data has been collected by the platform. So there are various aspects of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is relevant at every stage of development of the software to the uh, post-market surveillance stage, which is the post-approval stage of the software. So for cybersecurity, first we will see the standards. So there are certain IS, ISO, IEC standards available for cybersecurity in India, which a medical device software has to follow. Then there are QMS and cybersecurity requirements in which the quality of the data that is being collected is taken into account. Then personal data and cybersecurity. This exists because the data that is being collected by the software will be the personal data of the patient, and it has to follow the DPDP Act and rules, and it has to be managed in a certain way that it is not that it is not breaching the privacy of that person. Then substantial equivalence and cybersecurity. So at the time of submission of substantial equivalence of the device, of a medical device software, for softwares now the comparison of cybersecurity requirements is also required to be made by the manufacturers and importers at the time of applying for manufacturing and import licenses. So it is a major analysis that will be required to be submitted going forward. Then risk management and cybersecurity, obviously, because cybersecurity is ultimately protecting from the risk. So all the risks that are identified during the life cycle of the software has to be reported, documented, and controlled in a way. So cybersecurity and risk management always goes hand in hand. Then cybersecurity verification and validation records. Cybersecurity in itself, the prototype has to be tested in itself so that it is actually protecting the software that is in place. So its verification and validation records are also required to be maintained and submitted to CDSCO or the state licensing authority at the time of filing the applications. The next part is post-marketing surveillance and cyber security monitoring, which we have already discussed. The next part is data protection by medical device softwares, which I think Anay should take it up. Over to you, Anay.
Thanks, Monica. Appreciate it. Okay, so this is interesting. Data protection. We know that the DPDP Act is already in force. We know that its implementation is also around the corner, not more than a year left. And so every touch point where personal data is handled in some way or the other is getting regulated. Medical devices and specifically medical device software is no exception, right? So the important thing for us to understand is the regulator is already looking at medical device companies, MedTech companies, software companies, and saying that, look, have you included the privacy by design principle inside your medical device software, right? Is data access consent driven in your system, right? Is there any organizational safeguard that you have already built in? Let's say, for example, role-based access, which is already built in as a feature inside your software, right? Throughout the life cycle, how do you propose to ensure that the data protection related compliances are met by the software, right? So those kind of questions are being asked in the guidelines by the regulator to MedTech companies, and that requires some amount of analysis and discussion. Now, to be honest with you, not everyone, when I say everyone, I mean not every regulator is now fully apprised about the nuances of privacy, right? So for example, when we say consent, we know that there is this element of privacy notice. We know there is an element of request for consent. And under the DPDP Act, there may be requirements whereby the consent has to be asked in regional / other languages which are in the constitution, right? A lot of these things have to be thought about. I don't think they are being thought about now. I don't know if our medical device regulator is actually looking at privacy in such details. For us to know what is important is that the medical device regulator is looking at privacy related elements in medical device softwares. I think that's the key takeaway that we need to keep in mind, right? The last item on this sheet, which is about digital traceability, is important. Okay, just to take a step back, we know that when teleconsultation happens, auditable logs of teleconsultation, specifically auditable logs of consents, have to be maintained, right? We now know that within medical device software space, the regulator is saying maintain digital traceability. You should have auditable records of access to the software by relevant healthcare professionals and so on and so forth. Some of you who belong to a certain kind, so MedTech companies who actually are, let's say, in the ultrasonography business and so on and so forth, have already built in features where every time the medical device software is used, a certain log is created, right? But that is, say, for a requirement under PCP and DT law. But now the guidelines are saying that why not have this traceability for every kind of software, right? Let's not wait for, let's say, sonography kind of machines, right? Why not for every kind of software? So that conversation seems to have been hinted in the guidelines, but because it's there, you never know when it sort of takes a shape where it's a requirement under, in regular course, which is imposed by the regulator. As of now, as I said, we've not heard the regulator ask questions on privacy in reviewing medical device software license applications. But that day may not be far away. The guidelines are out. The guidelines are talking about privacy. Okay, Bhumika, next slide, please. Now, what should you do? Right, that's really the question. You need to assess whether the software that is being used in your respective businesses as a product, as a service, qualifies as medical device software or not. This is the discussion that we've had, right? We need to talk about, if it's a medical device, how is the life cycle sort of the software being controlled, whether it is triggering any obligations or licensing requirements that we were not aware of. How are we talking about cybersecurity and privacy related topics? If you have made an application and you have still gotten a license, then have you thought about raw material equivalent controls, which is basically the software bill of materials related conversation, which we will have in the subsequent slides. But is all of that in place so that today your business is working? You got your licenses when the regulations were not matured enough. You did not know that, okay, test license filing means this. So we have worked with clients and made applications where nobody knew how software was going to be approved, right? And software got approved, right? Our worry is that this may not be true in the next iteration. Whenever the renewal happens, more questions may be asked, more documentation may be expected. If an inspection happens, are we keeping the right records? Those kind of questions may come up, right? So we need to read these guidelines very closely. And even if licensed, we need to be prepared for the next round, right? Because those questions will come up. Next slide, please. Got it. I just wanted to spend some time on invoicing, because I think invoicing of medical devices is not very clear to anyone, right? Invoicing of medical devices is not covered in the guidelines. But invoicing of medical devices or medical device software specifically is the most important part or the most important conversation that needs to be had. Because honestly speaking, we all know that there is a license required in order to stock, sell, distribute medical devices, right? In case of invoicing, what is going to happen? The foreign manufacturer / distributor of an approved medical device. And when I say medical device, I mean medical device software. The foreign manufacturer of a medical device software is going to so-called sell the software to the Indian importer, right? At this point, how is the invoice going to look? What is going to be the shipping address on the invoice? Very, very important. Is there any role of customs in this? If, say, for example, if the export from a foreign country to say, for example, India was going to happen, customs would play a role. But what happens when medical devices get imported? When an invoice is raised by the foreign manufacturer to the Indian manufacturer or the Indian importer, no controls whatsoever, right? Because there are no controls, there is a very high chance of mistake happening. And if there is a mistake happening, if the address is wrong, if an unlicensed address is mentioned on the invoice, on the shipping, whatever, field of the invoice, there is a problem, because then who imported the address in which the import happened was not approved. The Indian importer has sold to the distributor. Now, who's really a distributor of medical device software? Right? What does that even mean? Right? So when a distributor sells a medical device software to the hospital and the importer sells to the distributor, everybody is downloading from the cloud. right? Nobody, honestly speaking, while Bhumika spoke about how physical medium are, used to put software and, labeling happens, really, actually, it's over the air and cloud related downloading, right? We all know that. So what does it mean? So when you invoice it the from the importer to the distributor to the hospital, and let's say hospital to the patient at some point, right? What actually is happening, right? There is no stock of medical device. The only thing is happening is sale, right? The sale is not happening from the premises, right? The medical devices is not stored on the premise from where the sale is happening. So these kind of questions will come up. The reason why I want to talk about this at least is because we need to go back, and just because there is nobody taking a look at this kind of transactions does not mean that the relevant invoices do not carry the mandatory details. For example, the license number of the seller and the license number of the buyer, right? It needs to be there. Even if it is a software, it's it's tantalizing to just do this transaction between two corporate offices, but that's wrong, right? It can't be done between two corporate offices. Similarly, when we see so many medical devices being listed on e-commerce platforms, or so many health trackers with medical device features being listed on e-commerce platforms and bought on e-commerce platforms, right? The entities that are selling, the e-commerce platforms that may be intermediating, it is not very clear whether it is the same, right? It needs to be sorted, it needs to be talked about enough, and some clarity needs to come that, okay, if this is my device, it has this feature, I have to invoice, this is what my invoice should say, this is what the purchasers say purchase order should say, and I need to copy paste it from the purchase order into my invoice. So those kind of conversations need to happen, which are currently not happening, and that is a risk area. Bhumika, next slide, please. The same thing applies to a manufacturer. So I'm not going to go over this again, but if you are, let's say, a manufacturing company and you're sort of invoicing a medical device software to a distributor who's onward selling, or any hospital, a hospital also needs a license, right? We know that, right? A hospital, unless the hospital has an ICU or is a government hospital, whatever, a hospital also needs a license to purchase pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and so on and so forth. So be very careful, right? Be very careful how you're invoicing the hospital. Okay, move on. Move on, Momenta. Right. I want to use this opportunity when we are talking about invoices to also talk about software bill of materials. This is a slightly new concept which did not exist before, but is now existing. In order to make sense of this, let's go back and understand that any raw material, when it is used in a product under drugs and cosmetics law, where medical devices are also regulated, that raw material has a testing requirement, and that testing requirement also has a record keeping requirement, right? So you would know who you bought it from, you test it, you will have a certificate of analysis that the seller gave you, you would test it, you will keep some records of whatever, and then you would eventually use it in the finished product. Now in software, that doesn't happen. In software, heavy use of software libraries is done. Just to give you an example, a software that is able to track facial features for security purposes can also be customized to track signs of diseases. For example, if a stroke is coming, for example, if Alzheimer's is onsetting, right? It's literally the same code. So now the raw material, the so-called starting material, is actually something which is not a medical device, but you need to still have a record of what did you use in your product, which eventually got shipped as a software, which is a medical device. All of this log is called software bill of materials, right? That kind of detailing needs to be in place, which currently because we've made applications and we've reviewed applications, so on and so forth, seem to not be the case with several medical device manufacturers. This is an explicit requirement of law. So let's have that. Let's have the software bill of materials ready. Okay, Bhumika, move on, please. Who should maintain a software bill of materials? As I said, some examples, AI software companies would have sort of understanding of, the basic image processing libraries and so on and so forth, which are, open sourced and things like that. All sorts of companies actually would need to keep an SBO, right? So these are some examples. You may please read it in your time. Omega, move on, please. Right. No conversation can be complete without talking about penalties, right? And especially in case of medical device software, because it's so new, because the guidelines are so new, it's important to keep an eye out for consequences. We have clients, as I said, and I gave an example of the client who knew that a particular feature in their tracker was a medical device, had made the application, but is now being prosecuted criminally, right? Despite doing everything because of some sort of oversights, right? Some things that one would not expect to happen, but they happen. We don't need to be reminded that our licensing authorities have ramped up investigation. The FDA is raiding. The CDSCO is reading. You can read it in the news. It's all out there, right? They are ramping up enforcement, and software as a medical device guidelines are very new, right? But they are final, which means they are in effect. It's not as if they're taking effect after a year. So it's important to read them, because any violation of the guidelines may be treated as violation of the medical device rules, which can have consequences, the least of which will be suspension or business continuity impact, the worst of which can be impact on the management, right? Some criminal prosecution somewhere here and there. So let's make sure that we are on top of these new guidelines which have come. All right. Now, Bhumika, I think we're done, right? Or is there anything else? Okay, so we have within time, we finished the webinar. A lot of you have asked questions. We are going to attempt to start answering questions one by one. But I understand that it's a Friday evening. You guys have taken time out, joined this webinar. I really appreciate that everybody who was with us at the start of the webinar, with few exceptions, have continued to stay with us. So this is really appreciated. Thank you very much for joining in. I hope that if we've covered things that will eventually be useful for you in your individual practices, if you're a professional or for the companies that you work for. Now, on that note, here is what we are going to do. We are going to now look at the questions in the chat and attempt to answer them. We will not, exceed this time too much. But if we have a answer handy, we will try to answer those questions immediately. Okay. Having said that, if you want to log out, feel free. We are going to answer these questions and anyway attempt to answer these questions and send our responses in brief over email to you along with the recording of this webinar. Right. So thank you very much for joining in. Now, going back to the questions. Okay, so quite a lot of questions, and we can start from the very beginning, right? The OTA update. So Mr. Rajgopal had a question. The OTA update example that I had given at the very beginning. I said that it falls under SIMD. Maybe there was some confusion. We were not trying to say that the OTA update would necessarily fall under an SIMD or an SAMD. I was trying to give that example to only indicate that it's not very clear, right? Like an OTA update, maybe SIMD, SAMD. Maybe this is why they have removed this distinction and they have basically said, is it part of a medical device or not part of a medical device? That sort of a distinction. So that SAMD, SIMD is out. If you ask me, the example I gave does not imply that it was an SIMD, because it would have sort of independent intended use and some features that would only be an add-on to the ventilator features, not ventilator features that you would typically expect. Do we label ventilator as a medic? So Hina is asking, do we label ventilator as a medical device software, or it is still seen as a medical device with software as one of the components in it? So Hina, the answer is we we do not label ventilator as a medical device software. The software version in the ventilator would be licensed as, I would say, a component of the medical device, but accessory / component of the medical device. So we do not label the ventilator as a software, right? It is a standalone piece of medical equipment with embedded software on it. Some advanced ventilators may have features. Those features, when they are used in the ventilator, depending on the nature of the feature, may trigger standalone medical device requirements or embedded medical device requirements. It will depend on what kind of feature is being used in the medical device. Okay. Now, Hina is further asking, in context of the question above, what do we call an infusion pump? That was confusing. Okay, so we will go back to slide 22 for you, Hina, but not now. If there is a confusion, we will clarify that. But long story very short, infusion pump is infusion pump, right? The labeling doesn't change. Infusion pump, okay, so it is a system. The system has an embedded software. That embedded software works along with the system to give an output. That output is your reading. So that system still is the infusion pump. It has an embedded software in it. But let's say, for example, there was an infusion pump that had a Bluetooth enabled control in my mobile phone, or a Wi-Fi enabled control in somebody else's mobile phone, or whatever. What happens? What happens to that software in the medical device, right? Is that a standalone software, or is that a medical device software? That's really the question, right? Now, because this software will affect the functionality of an existing insulin pump, it will not be a standalone software. It will be regulated as a medical device software, right? It is still MDSW, not SA-MDSW, right? Okay. Just moving on. Software used only. So Mr. Rajgopal is then asking, software used only for acceptance testing of medical device under a service login only. Software used only for acceptance testing of medical device under a service login only. Okay. Now, obviously, let me put it this way, and this question keeps appearing at a future date, future time also. Now, when should a company actually apply for test license for testing a medical device? When, first of all, obviously, you need to have version controls over every software that is being developed. When a particular version of the software that is being developed is ready for clinical deployment, you are ready that, no, this is the software that I want to introduce in the market. You put a number to that software and then take a license for that particular version number of software. What does that mean? It means that I am sitting in a lab developing versions of softwares, right? IT professionals, doctors, clinicians, whatever, developing versions of softwares, none of which is ready for, let's say, clinical testing or being deployed in the market. No such license is required. No license required. The moment you say that, no, here is a software that I want to take to the real world, that's when you will apply for test license. Is there a scope for abuse? Yes. Does it get abused? Yes. If it is caught that you actually, started supplying people with devices that had softwares which could be used in real world settings, that would amount to distribution of an unlicensed medical device that will result in criminal prosecution. So not worth it. So that's really the control. The question was, software is used only for acceptance testing of medical device under a service login only. I don't know if I've answered this question, but the long story short is, this, if it should not fall under medical device software, right? If all of this, the way it is being mentioned, the uses for acceptance testing only, etc., is being done, it's not a medical device in the classic sense. It doesn't have a clinical outcome, should not be a medical device. Next question is by Hina. Again, from a risk classification perspective, what is critical, serious, and non-serious? As if you remember when we were discussing the risk classification slide, there was this distinction that if a device is used for critical, serious, or non-serious purposes, then the risk classification changes. So, Hina, the answer is it's in the guidelines. right? And some of these sensitivities is also defined by who's the user of that particular feature. So for example, if the user is the target population is kids and not adults, the serious or criticality rating will change, right? So it's actually mentioned in the guidelines, and it's there, right? So if you read it, you'll find it. Okay, Hina has asked another question. She said, in a developer hands over design rights or algorithms codes to the company, then the ownership changes. In such cases, what happens, right? I think, Bhumika, do you know what the background to this question is? Do you want to take a shot? Okay, I think Bhumika is not here, but let her come back. If she comes back, uh, I will, uh, I will, uh, I will ask her to sort of, respond to this question. The other question was very interesting. The storage and handling instructions for standalone medical device software. I think these things would become relevant only when the software, the standalone software is sort of shipped on a physical medium like a CD drive or a USB drive and so on and so forth. Otherwise, how do you store a software on a cloud, or what are the handling instructions for software which is on the cloud? It just does not add up. So I agree. It's not applicable in that sense. And I think the regulator should also take a pragmatic view that some of these requirements would not appear. I think I see people are dropping out. And I don't know when Bhumika is going to come back, but let's respect time of people. Thanks, Rama. And why don't we do this? We'll conclude this webinar here. I will sort of make a list of these questions. We will ask our subject matter experts to take a shot at them. Some of the questions are obvious, some of the questions are not obvious, but that would help us in having a conversation with some of you who've had questions. For those of you who want to ask more questions, obviously you can reply back on the meeting link, or our contact details are here. We'll be very happy to hear from you. If you have any feedback on the session, please feel free to drop your feedback as well. That will be really appreciated. So on behalf of the Arogya legal team that made this webinar possible, on behalf of Bhumika, on behalf of myself, I thank all of you for joining this webinar session. Have a great evening ahead. Have a great weekend ahead. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.